Welcome, Brian Ladd here. We're scheduled to start at 4, and it looks like quite a few people are still logging in. So I'm just going to give it 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll get going. I appreciate everyone for taking time today to join us for this conversation. It's been something that we've had a lot of requests for. It's certainly a hot subject in general in Bend, and surprisingly enough, even in these times where we're focused on more short-term immediate needs and a little bit of triage with our local business environment, it's something that still the community wants to discuss. So I'm looking forward to getting diving into the details here with everybody today. So in about 2 minutes we'll start. I appreciate everyone for joining us. Okay, looks like we have quite a few people on, and I think we should get going. So everyone, I wish to start by thanking everybody for joining us today. This is a very interesting subject. There has been a lot of talk about this over the years here in Bend. And my goal today is to really not take sides with this, but to put some perspective on it, especially through the housing development and kind of planning lens in which I look through, as that's my industry and that's kind of my narrow field of expertise here in town. But I'm really excited about the people that are joining us here today. I think we should be very grateful to them. I'm going to go down and introduce everybody quite quickly. Let's start, and I believe his camera's not working, so I apologize if you can't see his face. But let's start with Brian Rank. He's the long-term planning manager over at the City of Bend. He managed the Bend urban growth boundary expansion that we've all been participants in and watchers of for the last number of years. And he directs a variety of land use, transportation, and infrastructure projects here in Bend, such as the Bend Transportation Plan and the Core Area Plan. So I think he is uber qualified to be here today, and I really appreciate him for joining us. Next, we've got Kirk Schuler, no less. He's been in Bend for a very long time. And he's the CEO of Brooks Resources, a prominent land development and development firm here in Bend. And he's really a keystone to this community, and he's given a lot back. And joining us today is just another example. And I look forward to the thoughts that he has on it. And then Ryan Swaggerty, I'm really excited that he's joining us. And he's got a variety of experiences. He is the Senior Director for Content Services at Ventana Research. But more importantly, he's a Vice Chair for the Bend 2030. This was a visionary board that helped direct and garner input from our community on who we wanted to be as Bend. And he's got a lot of great perspective to add for us today. So what we're going to do is I want to try to keep this relatively loose today. And what I'm going to do is just ask Kirk, Ryan, and Brian, as you have comments, jump in. Let's create an open dialogue about this. I think there's a lot of interesting things to discuss. And then I've got Steve over here. And as participants, you're watching, feel free to put out questions either in the Q&A or the chat. I'm not sure which one we prefer, but we'll keep an eye on those. And what we'll do is we'll bring those up as we go along. And hopefully we can create some really good 2- or 3-way dialogue as we go. So, to get going, once again, I just want to preface this by, we're not here to promote growth nor anti-growth. I'm simply trying to do this and help educate, help us understand, and help us understand how housing is really at the core of this issue. And then why we're having this discussion. This has been something that our clients have been asking about. We did a webinar a couple of weeks ago and we did a poll and it was the #1 item. And some of the headlines that you're going to see here speak to that as well. From Ben's growth rate in source. Is it scary or is it sustainable? The Ben Bulletin has headlines on housing affordability and how it's worsened in the last decade. And then that chart on the right, that's the one that really catches everyone's eyes. That shows how Bend has gone from being, a 30,000 person town in the 1990s up to, now cresting 100,000. There's some debate about exactly where we're at, whether it's 95, 100, 105, whatnot. But definitely when we're at a century mark on how many hundreds of, thousands of people we have in town, it's obviously a changing time for us here in Bend. And this is a hot topic. And so the next slide here, and what I'm about to do is pass this over to Brian. But I think it's important to talk about how this is not going to go away. This is not something that is magically going to disappear and people are going to find Bend less attractive. I threw a few things up here on this slide. The first one being, this is what a lot of people are familiar with. This is from the Milken Institute. And once again, Bend was the #1 best performing small city in the US for small metro areas. We led the nation in job growth and a bunch of different metrics. And then what we're also seeing is trends and trends from today related to the pandemic that we're all dealing with, where living in these big cities in New York and San Francisco, all of a sudden it's not as illustrious to live there. And then also companies are learning how to operate remotely at a level they've never done before. And so, one of these quotes from the New York Times is saying, a vast number of professionals are now working remotely and they're wishing to reconsider whether they want to live in a big city after all. The Ben Bulletin has said, we're the US capital of telecommuting. I think the USA Today actually came out with that originally. And then we've got one from the San Francisco Chronicle saying coronavirus is prompting residents to leave the Bay Area. So I think that if we were going to think that somehow these trends are going to stop in the long term, or at least feel that the pressure alleviate on us, is a little naive. And I think we need to come together as a community and talk about these, and really, decide who we want to be as a town. And I hope that, and I'm just about done here, I hope to elevate this discussion. There's a really great Hubble report that came out in 2019 on Bend on what growth means, what change means, and how we come together as a community to talk about it and define who we want to be as a town. And one quote in there that they came up with that I thought was particularly salient was, they want to go from a pro versus no to a deeper analysis. And I think we need to be cognizant of the feelings because everyone's got a different perspective. There's people that are very anti-growth, but then here's a comment that I found in an online chat room yesterday when I was trying to get a gauge on sentiment of Bend. And one of them said, if we stop growth, Bend's just going to become an enclave for the wealthy and workers are going to have to commute in. And then there was another quote from that Hubble report that I thought was very indicative of where we're at. Back in 2013, which if we remember, we were just starting to come out of that recession, half of the residents in Bend felt optimistic and positive about growth. And today, and this was last year, 2019, the research shed light that the loss of optimism has nearly 2/3 of our population now saying growth is having a negative impact on our community. So when we needed jobs more and when we were struggling, we were more appreciative of the growth. And then once we got our feet under us, it seemed like people had, a little bit more misgivings about it. So where we stand now is what the discussion that we're going to have today is widespread, but I think let's start with Brian. So I'm going to pass the microphone over to Brian, and I want to switch the slide over to one that talks about Senate Bill 10 and 100. These are bills that started in the late 60s and 1970s and tied directly into why Bend looks the way it is, why Oregon in general looks the way it is, and add some color to that. So Brian, do you feel comfortable kind of taking that on and talking a little bit about where we stand with the urban growth boundary and why Bend looks the way it does?
Sure, Brian. It's can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. And I thank you again for joining us. I know, you just got out of another committee here a few minutes ago, and, your time is appreciated. Thank you.
Oh, no, I appreciate this. And quite frankly, I think I wish we would do more of this at the city in terms of kind of these more online engagement tools. And I think the pandemic and our response to it is demonstrating that. Here I see 46 participants. That's more than we often get in an open house at the city. So I think it's thank you for hosting. And if you start looking at state mandates, the title of the slide, Senate Bill 10 and 100, I'm probably more of a current practitioner than I am a historian about urban growth boundaries. But needless to say that, the concept that was established back in the 70s was around essentially preservation of farmland and forest land outside of cities, and essentially keeping rural areas rural so we could support the timber industry, so we could support the agricultural industry, which is, as you know, really important, particularly in the north of here and then on the west side of Oregon. And so a lot of the laws that were established around protecting those lands in the rural areas meant that cities were the places for development, and that development would take place inside of a boundary called an urban growth boundary. And if you take a closer look at the laws at the time, a lot of folks don't know this, that there are a lot of requirements in Oregon that are very different than, for example, California, where there are time limits on cities to provide land use decisions. So essentially, there's a whole body of law that says in cities you're expected to have 20-year supplies of land of all types. So this is for residential, for employment, for recreational, for churches, for schools, for parks. You need to have that land, and that land needs to be more or less serviceable with infrastructure that can serve it. We have to have plans for infrastructure. And then there are a whole body of laws that say should make it pretty easy to get development done. Now, as anybody who works in development knows, it's not easy, it's costly, there are permits and there are fees, but I end up talking with developers from California, big developers, who say, wait, you can't, we don't have to do years worth of environmental work, for example, once we're in the city. So why do we do this? We do this in Oregon, well, because it's state law. I mean, if you essentially want to, every city has to maintain a supply of land, presumably for 20 years. And it's kind of this revolving game of setting a 20-year supply, moving into that supply, creating a new 20-year supply. I think what you should understand about that plan is that it's incredibly litigious. It's very complex. It's a whole bunch of assumptions about the future, and a whole bunch of very strong values that people have about growth. And then it manifests, as Kirk Schuler knows, he was on this advisory committee, and many folks who probably observed that process that was recently completed in 2016 would know it's a whole bunch of battling assumptions about the future. How fast are we going to grow? How dense should we be? Do people want multifamily? Should we have single family? So values backed in assumptions. And then at the end, I think, because it is about assumptions, and I think this is about the future state of the city, I really think it's important that people come to an agreement about this. It's more important, I think, to agree upon our and kind of come together around a shared vision rather than have the complete technical perfection and accuracy. I'm looking at your bullet points here, Brian, and system of growth, not California, not Idaho. I agree. I think it's an important part of what makes Oregon, Oregon. You can love it or hate it. And there are times when I love it and there are times when I hate it, to be honest. It can be very difficult to work in, but I can also see the benefits of the UGB as an idea around urban development. Planning versus infrastructure delivery. I think just the point I want to make there is that, you know, we talk about expanding urban growth boundaries, and essentially that's a line on a map. And we're trying to do this very thoughtfully, where we expand the types of uses, a mix of uses, essentially trying to create more livable places as we're moving out, trying to complement what's inside the current city limits in UGB. But once you do that, the provision of infrastructure is arguably much more difficult and much more expensive, and something that is not really appreciated in terms of creating serviceable, developable land. If you want serviceable, developable land on a routine supply to supply the market, that means people are going to have to pay for it. And that is the point where I see the most friction, is that most of the time people either don't want to pay more fees or more taxes or more rates in order to substantiate the water and sewer systems and road systems to kind of create the infrastructure to make shovel-ready serviceable land. So that's just something I will mention, throw it out there. Next steps, next UGB, we have a legal requirement. These legal requirements since the 70s have grown and grown and grown. We have new ones. So we have a legal requirement to update our housing needs assessment by 2023. Which means looking at expanding our urban growth boundary, saying that within a budgetary situation where we're looking at budget reductions right now for our department and other city functions. So at that, I'll leave it at that. I don't want to keep running on the mouth here, but give it a couple more years and we should be starting that really soon, but that takes a council goal. It'll take budget. It takes a ton of staff time. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, you unpacked, you know, you put a lot out there, and I just want to unpack a few things. You know, I think Bend was always, or excuse me, Oregon in general was always noticeably different from the other Western states. I grew up in Colorado. I had family up in Washington. We have family in California. I have family in Idaho. I have family in Montana. And I'm very familiar about how the West and the Pacific Northwest generally develops. And what I noticed originally when I first came to Oregon was how we weren't the sprawling, low density infrastructure that I saw in those other states. And we had a very defined, urban rural divide. And I assume, you know, you're going to state that that all goes back to these early 70s land use laws and mandates from the state, correct?
A lot of that does actually. A lot of what you do see, it's interesting in Central Oregon, when you see more rural development, you could look north or south of Bend. There are rural subdivisions out there. A lot of those were approved prior to all the land use laws coming into effect. Like the Chutes River Woods is a good example.
Yeah,
is an example of what it would be difficult, if not impossible, to do now.
Yeah, and so hopefully this helps provide a little color for people that that just simply want to say, hey, why doesn't the city allow more density and give us more land? Obviously there are some hurdles. How long, just as kind of a quick synopsis on this, how long did it take the city from their initial idea that they wanted to expand that urban growth boundary to actually getting it approved by the state? What was the time period on that?
I think you could go, optimistic would be like 10 plus years. More realistic with all the amount of work involved in population projections and things like that, probably closer to 12 to 13 years.
12 to 13 years. And the last urban growth boundary that just was approved, how many acres did that bring that into the UGB?
2,300 plus or minus 2,380 to be exact.
Okay. So it took a long time to get those, and then even when it's brought in, they're not necessarily ready to go, right?
Correct. Yeah. The typical approach is, you expand. So if you think of your system of plans that you need to have in place in order for a developer to take down a 5, 10, 100 acre parcel, whatever it may be, you have to have your land use in place. That would be urban growth boundary, and you have to know what you're planning for, and then you have to have your water, sewer, and transportation plans that complement that set of uses that you just brought in. So that process I just described sounds very simple, but can take years and millions of dollars.
Yeah, so I think this is a good time to pass the mic over and have a conversation with Kirk, because I think as we talk about bringing land in the urban growth boundary, the challenges with even first getting it within the urban growth boundary in the first place, but then the cost of actually delivering it, providing infrastructure, who pays for that infrastructure. I think this is a nice intersection where maybe Kirk and you, Brian, can talk a little bit about this infrastructure, how it's created, how the boots on the ground created, and you know, how it's actually delivered from this state mandated plan all the way down to a company like Brooks that's actually going to create lots for housing here in Bend.
Well, thanks, Brian. Brian Rankin, good job describing UGB and the issues surrounding it. And we certainly have operated with the UGB since its adoption, but Brooks Resources actually developed before the UGB and developed subdivisions, some of those rural subdivisions Brian mentioned. But the issue of getting land in the UGB is obviously the first step. And the UGB was adopted, I believe, in December of 16. Was that right, Brian?
Yes.
And so we are developing some land that we own that was in the expansion area. Its first phase is just getting done. And the first house will probably be finished this fall, so the fall of 2020. And with that, I think you can see how long it takes, because as Brian knows, we were actually preparing and doing our master plan before we even, before the UGB was completed. So it'll be almost just under 4 years from the time the UGB was expanded until the first house is delivered. And in my understanding, we're the first of the expansion areas to have any development in them. So why does it take so long? We have to go through the land use process that was created around the expansion, and that included submitting for a master plan approval. And even before that, I should back up, there was a year we spent analyzing the transportation and sewer and water impacts and negotiating, basically, analyzing that data with the city, working with our neighbors who had come into the UGB and coming up with a development agreement with the city on who would build that. All of the infrastructure in this case, on this land on the west side of Bend, just outside of Northwest Crossing, all the infrastructure was pretty much, is pretty much being paid for privately, other than some sewer pump station upgrades where there's some SDC or system development charge money that is available for reimbursement. But so that answers a little bit of the question in this case. It does vary on who pays for that. But after getting the development agreement in place, we had a master plan application that took close to a year, and it was approved and our land became annexed. Then we have to prepare engineering drawings and a tentative plan to show the more detailed lot configuration. What's on the screen is the colored map is our master plan map. We have to take that to a final map of lot sizes and dimensions, the engineering drawings for the roads and the other infrastructure. That all goes through a process of approval by the city, and then you got to build it, and it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 months to build a phase of lots, and then a home takes another from approval by the city, probably would take 4 to 6 months, maybe 9 months on a larger home, and sometimes on a custom home even longer than that. So I mean, that's process, that's the timing. That's time is money. I guess maybe that answers the question of why it costs so much.
Yeah.
Somebody has to buy the land and then make all that investment and take that risk. And And not that there's even, you know, land development itself is kind of funny because land is the last variable in the cost of a home. When you go to buy a home or build a home, your fees are determined by the city, that you permit fees. Your materials are pretty much set by a much larger market. You know, your lumber and your concretes and things like that. Your labor markets here to build are usually bid, and you either accept that bid and build your home, or you don't and don't build your home. But the land cost, even though we put a price on a lot, if the market doesn't can't bear the cost of that home, the land is usually what takes the first hit. So that's our risk analysis of the business we're in.
Well, and there's a lot of risk being taken there. You know, I know some other price point builders that have more or less given up on trying to produce much housing in Oregon in general, because, you know, they can go to a Meridian, Idaho or something like that,
Right.
buy a 40-acre piece, carve it up, get entitlements, and have new lots, relatively affordable lots that allow them to build price point homes in a matter of 9 to 12 months, when that process would be 5 to 10 years here, with a 3 or 4x on the price of all the entitlements.
You know, the next phase that we'll do, it'll be ready in the fall. So I mean, once you get past all those initial hurdles, time gets compressed, and that helps.
Yeah.
But just to get to your point a little bit, the real cost factors of a home include the bare land costs that you pay to buy that land. And those prices in Bend have fluctuated through the recession and pre-recession and recession, and now back to where we are now, which is high. So the bare land costs, but clearly the fee system is higher in Oregon with the system development charges. We pay, Brian probably knows this, low $20,000 on a single family home or SDCs.
It includes parks too. That typically includes parks. Yeah. So we're and for folks that don't know what an SDC is, for folks who are out of state, system development charge, it's a per unit. It's basically a consumption tax. I know, Kirk, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially there's a methodology that says if you have your average single family home, then you need to pay for your percentage of our transportation, water, and sewer systems, and based on your trips and your usage, and therefore it costs BAM. So people, anyway, Kirk.
I think if you're from California, the term impact fee would be appropriate. And it's sewer, water, streets, and parks, as Brian pointed out. There's a park fee in there. So, but so you have all that, and then in Central Oregon, we are light on our trades. Our workforce was thinned out pretty hard during the recession and is yet to recover fully. So our costs for subcontractors to build your home or to build the lots and put in the infrastructure, those prices have continued to rise. And then, of course, lastly, which isn't a cost factor, this is a price factor, and it's the demand for the home. You know, when we live in a community in a region like Central Oregon, and people want to live here, coupled with a low supply, and I just explained one of the low supply issues is it's been almost 4 years before a first home got built in an expansion area. But that's what sort of compounds the cost issue, right? Once the demand is there, and we end up with an affordability issue at that point. Yeah. So,
well, and Steve, maybe you could go back to that Discovery West slide. This isn't ordinary housing anymore. This is not 10,000 or 10, 15,000 square foot lots in a grid pattern anymore. This is complicated housing. Would you give some, and these are also mandates driven by the city as well, where not only does the state mandate that when you can have so much land, but then you also are required to add density and different types of housing and different types of zonings within that, right, Brian? I think I lost Brian, but
Sorry about that, Brian.
Oh, no, that's fine. I guess what I'm just getting to is let's, Discovery West, this is a good picture. Here we are looking at the northwest corner, and this was actually part of the previous phase, but we're going to see more housing types like this, as you see on the upper right in Discovery West. But Kirk and Brian, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the types of housing and, some of the different types of product that, this zoning mandates and what we're going to see more of in the future.
And, Kirk, do you want to talk about Discovery West, or
I think it'd be good if you talked about the UGB expansion and the designations and how you guys get to that point, and I'll take it from there.
Yeah, and Kirk he can key in on this, because we had a number of almost philosophical discussions about Oregon land use planning. And Oregon land use planning, when we look out 20 years, it's a combination of two factors: housing need, which is different than housing demand. So Kirk kind of hit on this point of, we have a certain demand, but then we also have local residents with a certain purchasing power. So we look at our residents statistically and just demographically, and say we have X number of people in X income groups, and we expect these changes in 20 years, and therefore we need to have housing that's priced at certain price points, and therefore we need to have a certain housing mix. And a lot of discussion about the balance between essentially trying to provide for housing types that are more affordable versus more housing types which are in higher demand. And demand is kind of maybe not the exact perfect term here, but and we have to come up with a housing mix. And then we essentially put designations on land and use the kind of, I would call it a relatively crude but necessary tool of density as a way to estimate how to get at certain kinds of units going forward. We paint that across the landscape and do our best to try to maintain those supplies.
And so the UGB process for this example, so this the colored area in the map in the middle was a 245 acre. It is a 245 acre parcel that was included in the UGB expansion. And on that parcel, the UGB process designated 650 residential units. And those 650 units would be made up of 449 single-family detached homes, 60 attached single-family units. And the attached single-family think of them as townhomes or basically single units on a legal lot, but attached, or at least at a certain density. And then multifamily, there were going to be 141, I think the number is. Hopefully that all adds up to 650. And so then it's up to us then to take that designation and design the neighborhood and integrate those uses. And we developed Northwest Crossing, which is, you can see just to the right or east of the colored map, which was about 1,300 units, residential units. And again, same concept. There were a lot of different uses, and the colored image to your left is actually a Northwest Crossing project. But what you can see in the picture, what I think is interesting, is behind the buildings that are being highlighted, to the left is a large multifamily building. There's commercial buildings right here at the roundabout. And even behind these two units along that street, there's those little row houses. Those are townhomes. And then there's single family residential right behind that. And so, we've adopted the philosophy of creating these mixed neighborhoods, if you will. And so when we applied our master plan map, when we submitted it, we showed the yellow in that map as single family detached. So that's your typical house that you would anticipate, although of course it can have an ADU on it, an accessory dwelling unit over a garage or something like that. And then what we did is we took the attached single family, these townhomes, and we took the multifamily. And again, multifamily could be a condo or it could be anything from a duplex up on one legal lot. And we put them in what we call the mixed housing zone. And it's the red color. And you can see we put it in two places. And The one that's in the center of the project is depicted in a very concept way up in the upper right corner with a mix of those houses. And what you see are some cottages right in the front, and then other townhomes and small apartments. And when we talk about small apartment buildings, not small units, but small buildings, we use the term a lot of times, it's been coined recently, the missing middle housing. And what that is that's the multifamily type housing that might integrate with a single family detached neighborhood. So you may have a fourplex, a fiveplex, or a sixplex that it orients itself, it sits at an intersection of some sort that is at the entry to a single family detached neighborhood or adjacent to it, but essentially the building looks more like a large home and has 4, 5, or 6 units in it. So that's what we're planning to do to integrate these ideas that came through the UGB.
Yeah, and obviously creating that, what they call the missing middle is not an easy task. I mean, to create apartments on one end and single family lots on the other are fairly straightforward, but to integrate all this types of housing from duplexes to triplexes to townhomes to whatnot is expensive and complicated. And I threw a few pictures up here, and I'm going to get to Ryan because this is a good dovetail into Ryan and what he's been doing. A lot of community involvement was engaged in this, and actually I also showed a picture of something that was already delivered, and I'd like to give a little shout out to, this was delivered by Greg Welch Construction. I think Muddy River Design did this beautiful design. This was the bungalows, correct me if I'm wrong, over by the Lewis and Clark Park in the previous phases of Northwest Crossing. And when one drives by this, they may not understand this is a condo project. And it added quite a bit of density in a single family section of that neighborhood. But yet it worked quite well. And I assume we're going to see more types of this product in Discovery West, Kirk?
Well, I actually think it's evolving. I mean, Greg built that. That was a unique first set of condos in Northwest Crossing, and it came off. It looks great. It fits into the neighborhood well. But yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I guess I don't know is the answer, right? Because we don't necessarily build all the buildings. So what we'll create are lots, and we'll tell people who are buying these lots what needs to happen on that lot. And if it's multifamily, it could be a condo or it could be an apartment.
Okay. And so Brian, so the city planning ties into this by doing mandates for this type of housing, and then it's up to the developers and the builders to actually put it forth, correct?
Yeah, I think a lot of people often think the city is actually out there building, building things or telling people to build something specific, which is just quite frankly, just not the way it is. We have zones that say you can do certain things here. And if you're going to do certain things here, this is how they have to be built. The height, the massing, the density, and, you're generally trying to keep compatible uses together and you don't want a hog farm next to a subdivision. So some obvious things like that, but I couldn't help but think that there's a strong connection between the state. There was a recent House bill that said, cities where we allow these residential uses, we're going to have to basically allow a greater array of residential uses. We're going to have to allow triplexes and duplexes, and we're going to have to broaden the uses that are and allow more density in existing neighborhoods in order to tackle this housing crisis. And the state said that cities shall do that. And the reason for that is that a lot of times cities, because they're run by, city councils, political bodies, can be influenced by the NIMBY, not my backyard kind of sentiment. And so a lot of political folks, I'm not saying our council necessarily, but across the state, we have pretty restrictive standards in a lot of cases. You can't essentially build a neighborhood you could build in 1920. And Kirk is probably laughing about that because that's kind of what you look at older parts of the city. And the way I look at it is that a lot of the newest movement in city planning is actually to get out of the way and to essentially help it get back to what you could do back before some of these standards were put in place in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when there may have been other drivers behind some of these zoning laws, as having to do with class and race and some other factors that we don't often talk about. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well,
we had to write our own code for Northwest Crossing. So,
wow, times are changing. Well, let's go to that next slide, Steve. Then this one, and we'll quickly get off this because I want to get to Ryan, but I think this is relevant because so often we're saying, well, why can't we have, cheaper housing? And I think a lot of it just has to do with supply and demand, supply of that land, supply of those homes, and the demand being put forth on it. And Kirk provided this great graph on the left. And do you want to speak a little bit to that, and we can kind of pull out, what it means?
Well, that chart is we were just tracking the number of permits being pulled versus the number of lots being platted, right? So you can just see that the platted lot. Now, when I say a permit, that's the permit to build a home on a finished lot. So a lot that's ready for a house. Yeah. And platting is how you create that lot, right? So you can just see it's lagging behind since 2009, it's the permits have outpaced the creation of the lots. And
so less permits, more sales. Obviously, we're running out of supply, right?
Yeah, and so this is really new housing, right? This is new construction. That this is impacting, but I don't know, demographics are the way they are. People turn over a home every so often, so there's always existing homes that are in the market too, but we're obviously shrinking the supply of new homes in this graph.
Correct. Yeah, and I think also a really salient point on this is if we look to the left side of it, we had roughly double the amount of building permits back in 2005, 2006 than we do now. So as much as we think that we're in a building boom because we're seeing it in certain pockets, we're growing in population by leaps and bounds, and we're still producing about half the housing that we did back in the peak. So I think we all need to let that sink in. There was actually one stat that I looked at recently that said for every 3 people that move to Bend, we're providing 1 house. So we are in a statewide in a huge deficiency we have a huge deficiency of homes available. And unless the migration trends stop and people stop making Oregon the #1 in-migration state in the nation, we're going to see continued pressure on the supply that we have. And that's why I put the graph on the right, showing what's happened to prices. This is the last 10 years of housing prices in Central Oregon. And this went from the kind of the low to mid 200s in Bend up to we're just shy of 500,000 for median pricing, which is uncomfortable by all standards. But when we have limited supply, whether it's land use laws or whatnot, I think it helps explain why we've had the pricing pressures that we have. So, with that, I'd like to open the microphone and jump to the next slide and thank Ryan for being here. And I'd like to hear a little more from him. This is where I think as a community, the great thing about the planning process in general is that it welcomes, input from the communities. But then there's big drivers like Bend 2030. And I think I'd like, Ryan, if you want to take the lead on this and talk a little bit about Bend 2030, what it meant, how it helped drive some of the vision of the law, where Bend will be in the future. And then just talk a little bit about where you guys are going from here.
Sure. Yeah, I'll take the mic reluctantly. I'm enjoying listening to Kirk and Brian. I think Bend 2030 has been around, and I'll also say here a caveat that both of these gentlemen possibly know more about this than even I do. I'm involved right now on the board of Bend 2030 in a volunteer capacity. I'm the current vice chair. I know Brian Rankin was on the board back in its past. This organization started around the organization itself, 2008. I think what happened was the city in '05 went through a visioning process. You posed the question to the city posed the question to the community, what do we want our city to look like in the year 2030? So at the time, that's 25 years out. That feels like a very long horizon. And the community engaged with that question. And coming out of that process, there was a report published. This is in June of 2006. They kind of codified and wrapped everything up. And that's the city's vision for 2030, what Bend will be in 2030. And you can find that, I'll pitch our website, bend2030.org. You can find that vision there on the site and take a look. It's interesting. There's, the way it was broken down was 6 key pillars, 6 key themes, you'd call them: a well-planned city, a vibrant economy, quality environment, safe, healthy people, a strong community, and a creative learning culture. And the things that plan set out, or that vision set out, are things that, again, long-range targets, some with specificity, but some more general ideas. We want an inclusive community that's welcome to all, for instance. That's a general idea. A specific target that was in there was, we would love to have a 4-year university. And so here we are in 2020, and we do indeed have OSU Cascades here now. So there's an example. I think folks around the community who've been around for a lot of this process and this time frame point to having a vision as something that then the vision itself can then be acted upon, or can be a North Star guiding principle as all sorts of conversations happen. So that's kind of a macro on Bend 2030. And then specifically, I'll mention too, one of our more recent projects is this project that you've had some slides up here from, the Missing Middle Housing Workforce Work Group. There were a lot of words in the name of the group, but that wrapped up about 3 years ago now. There we go. The Collaborative Housing Work Group, middle market housing, the missing middle, workforce housing. Those are kind of all the labels on there. And Kirk was on the steering committee for that, and Brian Rankin was a great resource to that work group from the city. I know, Brian, you came and spoke a number of times on various topics to that work group. And so this is, Bend 2030 kind of convened a large group of folks for this work group, including developers. You can see down there the sponsor list, but so Parks and Recs is in there, cities in there, COBA, COAR, builders like Brooks, developers like Brooks, land use attorneys, Land Watch was part of that group. So a diverse group to talk about some of these specific issues. The goal being that, whenever you're talking about affordability and housing, as we've just said, if you're not taking into account or starting with an acknowledgement of the realities of supply and demand and the constraints put on the land constraints mandated by our state, et cetera, you're not being realistic. So within those constraints, are there things that we nonetheless can do to help encourage the city or county, if that may be the case, can do to help encourage developers or help encourage development in general to happen for these specific typologies that are housing that can target that middle market. We're proud of that work. I think, coming out of that, this is another thing you can find on the website. Coming out of that work group, the group there's a report that had 12 recommendations that kind of the group decided were things most of us could agree on in terms of things to advocate for. And those are now all in various states of traveling downstream. One of the recommendations, for instance, was, hey, let's allow fourplexes in the RS zone, the residential, that smallest residential zone. And so that, for instance, has been working through as a change that has been pursued. So it's a way, that work group was a way to try to address these problems, because Kirk, as you said, there's all these factors that go into housing, and one of the ones you mentioned is trades, the availability of folks working in the trades. And then you say, well, why is that workforce washed out of our area? And you go, well, housing affordability is a big part of what can help that that group flourish again in Bend. So there's a lot of these chicken and egg type things. And our goal with this particular work group was to try to see if there were incremental ways to, smaller levers, larger levers, any levers we could use to help impact costs, development costs, availability of zones within the city within which to develop, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
Well, that's quite a task that you guys took on there. And to be honest, I don't think there are many cities that have the sophistication or the planning that create visions 25, 30 years in advance. My brother came in from a Montana town with a B name as well, but a different B name. And, he asked his city council, what's our vision for the future? And they have trouble talking about it. And so, I think talking about how your group envisioned a university here that was in input from the city that the citizens of Bend wanted. And it took, how long, 15 years to make it happen. But here it is. It's, I think, a reminder to the force of coming together as a community and talking about it.
Yeah. And I would emphasize too, that was the community's vision. And, Bend 2030, more than anything else, I think our goal is to convene these conversations to help facilitate these conversations when there's a need to have them, rather than being a group that's kind of dictating what the vision is. Really, at this point, this organization is a keeper of the vision that the community developed.
I think that's wonderful, and that that work group that you guys were part of, and the title I think is appropriate: collaboration done right. And the fact that you can involve, universities and the city and private developers, I think it's a pretty unusual group, and there was probably some very interesting meetings. I'm sure they were spiced at times. But I'm impressed.
These aren't clean conversations. And I think that's, that's an important thing to emphasize. You mentioned at the beginning, we're not, this particular webinar, we're not pro-growth, not anti-growth. And they're tough conversations. And so you need to treat that conversation with respect to reduce it to something as simplistic as NIMBY or YIMBY. That's tough. And at the end of the day, it's hard to be productive with a conversation that's framed that way. So that's what we're excited to do as an organization, is help facilitate conversations that are messy, and see where we can go if we can have a productive conversation.
Well, I appreciate that. And speaking of where you're going to go, I know that you guys still have some planning to do around it and some formalization of it. But can you give us a 10-second snippet on what Vision 2050 is?
Yeah, I mean, so 2030, that's only 10 years away now. And another reality of that vision is that the community that participated in that vision process, that's 15 years ago now. And so our community has grown, and we've been kind of putting our ear to the ground the past couple years, and it does feel, we're hearing from a lot of folks, it may be time to refresh and update that long-term vision. And a lot of things, I think a lot of values that are in that original vision will be shared values that we still hold true now. So it's interesting timing right now. Long-term thinking and long-term planning or vision casting, always important. Right now, we're focused on a much more urgent matters. And so there's some timing questions about when that'll move forward in terms of an active engagement effort. But certainly coming out of a crisis like this, very often these are fertile times for thinking about what we would like the vision to be going forward. So we're looking forward to harnessing that. But yeah, right now, certainly all our member organizations are focused on the efforts at hand, and all of our, on the volunteer board, for instance, folks are heads down, helping people right now. So
yeah, it's interesting because it's hard to look forward that many years when we've had the economic correction and pressures that we have right now, and businesses struggling and people looking for jobs. And so I appreciate all that you've done on that. I think there's some other good ways I want to point to, just for if people have a feeling in their chest that they believe is not being represented in our city. Some of the other ways that I came across in our discussions of ways to get involved. I think Ben 2030, Vision 2050 are great ways to really talk long-term. But for more immediate input, I think the Ben Neighborhood Association is a great way to have your voice heard. And this has become a big city initiative where anytime there's new developments, they look for the input of these neighborhood associations. Brian, have you seen that grow and change over the years? It certainly seems like a more concerted effort by the city to hear the voices of these neighborhoods over the last number of years.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it has occurred in kind of fits and starts, and then there are also just resourcing issues too, you know, trying to get neighborhood associations up and running and support them, and how does the city support them, and also create, you know, support yet autonomous. So there's that kind of, you know, a desire to support something. And I know that we have looked at different formats of how to support them, and I think we now have essentially a position. I believe it was Joshua, and they're making changes in our communications department, but an individual that is really there to help the neighborhood associations connect with the city, listen to their needs, get them what they need. A lot of staff assistance on various topics that they might be interested in. We bring projects to the neighborhood associations, for example, kind of talking tours, speaking tours. We do surveys through them as well. The transportation systems plan, for example, we worked with neighborhood associations, quadrants of them, and asked what their values were and the projects they wanted. So yeah, I think it's a great way to get involved and to support. You're supporting a neighborhood association, and they should be able to plug you into the city and give you another outlet there.
Great, and I think the last one that I want to point at is the Department of Land Conservation and Development for the state. When they do these urban growth expansions, they have a very lofty set of ideals and goals. They have 19 of them stated on their website, from basically environment to natural resources to economic development to housing, urbanization, et cetera, et cetera. But sitting at the very top of that is citizen involvement. And Brian, you were probably on the front lines of that, but I think that's pretty impressive. And I guess I could alleviate fears that there's not going to be an urban growth boundary magically drawn and expanded around Bend without everyone in our community having a voice in that matter.
Well, I obviously going to second that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the last time we had, I think the largest assembly of advisory committees we had ever put together, we had a 60-person advisory committee system, 3 different committees. We had a steering committee, and we also did public surveys. We did open houses, a number of public speaking events, and then online engagement tools. And we'll come up with new ones as well. I think we're just always evolving on how to involve citizens, and so we're going to keep evolving.
That's great, and we'll start wrapping this up. But I want to flip ahead to the next slide, just because we have a choice, and I see a lot of things through the term of housing and real estate. That's who I am, but I think it goes beyond that. So what I did here is I quickly pulled up a graph of 4 similar cities and towns, and what our future can be, and I tried to bookend it a little bit. I think kind of the most relevant, if we were to somehow peel away all these state mandated growth restrictions from Oregon, we could go to one end of the bookend, which is I have on the top left there. That's Boise, Idaho. This is where developers can go buy 40-acre pieces of land, quickly entitle it, have low density development in all directions. And it certainly creates more affordable housing. The median housing price in Boise right now is $341,000. And we sit at, just shy of 500. So obviously there is more affordable housing there given those types of land use laws. But I think that we need to understand that there's no free lunch, right? And the way I see it is that we have to accept both sides of that coin. If that's something that someone says, hey, why don't we just produce more land like Idaho does? Why don't we develop more? Why don't we make cheaper land for the developers so we can build more houses? I think we need to understand that the costs that come with that. And if anyone's been in that area recently, I think you might understand where you're in 4 and 5 lanes of traffic with grid development roads, and you're going 5 miles an hour, and you don't have the connectivity of the parks and whatnot. And I still love the area, and I have family there, and it has a lot of great attributes as well, but I just think we need to understand that there's both sides to that coin. Kirk or Ryan or Brian, do you have any insight of kind of, an agreement or disagreement with kind of that as a one end of the alternative spectrum with land planning and housing prices?
Well, I would say that example plays out all over the United States. You go to Texas, where median prices are, except for Austin, but the land is, I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. You just drove out in the desert and bought more land for $100 an acre. And that helps. That's how you build 4 or 5 floor plans, 500 times. That's how you keep the cost relative. You keep it down, right? I mean, so if you're a production approach and your basis is low in the land, I'm not saying Boise is that bad off. I mean, I think Boise has some positives, but it's not science, it's kind of math.
Yep, it's not magic. And let's go back to that slide real quick, because on the other end of the bookend, there's the extreme example. Steve, could you bring us back to that slide? The extreme example, this would be like a true mountain town, closed door, we're not growing mountain town of, let's say, in Aspen, where the average price is $1.8 million. And there's no true community there. For a working family that wants to live in a place like that, it's completely unattainable. And even if you say, hey, that's an unfair example, let's go to something that's a little bit more similar. Let's go to a Boulder, Colorado. A Boulder, Colorado even has more reuse restrictions than we have. They have it's been a long time. I actually was born in Boulder Community Hospital. Didn't grow up there, but I went to the business school there as well. And it's been a long time, but the last time I was there, they had a 1% growth cap on the city. Very, very difficult to add any sort of housing. And their median price is $800,000. And obviously there's a lot of factors that play into that, but I think that could be a very viable direction. And if we were to put more housing, anti-growth mentality on what Bend is and how we grow, I don't think it could be that far off that we head in a direction like that. And then I look back at Bend, and we're somewhat in the middle of this spectrum. Yes, we're uncomfortably high on housing prices, but it seems like we've got a little bit of these, we're an amalgamation of a lot of these places, and I think our price reflects that. But I'm going to go back to there's no such thing as a free lunch here. And I would love if anyone watching has any opinions on this or questions, throw that in there. And then I just want to end this let's flip to the next slide, just kind of on some open discussions, because I think that we need to understand that it's complicated. And I think there's an inherent conflict for a desire for well-designed, low-density, high-amenity housing, but then affordability. Affordability versus stopping growth. That urban critical mass versus the rural feel of Oregon that we love so much. I think that, unfortunately, that urban-rural divide is growing in Oregon in general. A lot of the people that live in that more rural environment had more agricultural based jobs, are feeling left out and not understanding these land use laws and costs that come with them. But I think it's a very nuanced discussion, and we need to understand that there's no easy out. And then the other thing that I've always tried to challenge myself with, that as I've been here, for a while now, is I try not to allow myself, and this is just, for my personal thing, and I'm not accusing anyone else of it, is try not to hypocritically, close the door behind me. and picture, Bend as a snapshot in time, because Ben's different for me than when I arrived, but I'm sure that it was very different in 1990 and 1970. And it's always been something that changes over time. And I once was having a conversation with Roger Lee, who's the head of our Economic Development Council for Central Oregon. And he said, picking a snapshot in time and saying this is Bend and we're not going to change is like sitting on a knife edge, in the sense that you can be more easily disrupted by trends if you're not creating new types of jobs, if you're not moving forward. It's a very precarious place to be, and change is inevitable. And hopefully maybe we can, change the word a little bit from growth to change, and we can all decide, how Bend changes. America has a lot of freedoms, and unless we start restricting, who gets to come into Bend, and that's not a Bend that I would want to be part of. I think we have to understand how we collectively, create that voice and vision for who we are as a town. And, to quote the 2000, let's go to that next slide, to quote that Hubble report, and I put links to all these references here in the end. There was one quote in there that really got to me. It says, growth isn't the issue, it's the change that it creates. And I guess I challenge everyone to become engaged and voice your vision for the future. But yet at the same time, I challenge us all to remain grateful for those who helped create this amazing and dynamic town that we all call home. And I think that's something I always try to remind myself of, because Bend didn't happen by accident. It was created by a lot of forward-thinking optimists, and I personally am very optimistic about the future, and grateful that we have the ability to even have these discussions about who we want to be and where we want to be in the future. Kirk, Ryan, Brian, do you have any closing comments or thoughts, or do we have any? It doesn't look like, maybe we have a few Q&As popping up here. But is there any other closing comments that you would like to talk about before we let everybody go here today?
I'll just be real quick. I do believe, my opinion is, Oregon does have a good balance. You showed the contrasting environments. And to one of the questions that was asked that I see here is about the difference between Sun Valley and Boise, right? Sort of like that example you showed between Aspen and a Bend, or an Aspen and there are places where wealth is accumulated, and it's not as you pointed out, it's not very diverse, or it doesn't have much going on other than a single purpose. And communities like Bend and Boise have a multi-purpose aspect to it. I think Oregon's land use laws promote that, at the same time preserving open space and the environment outside of those UGBs. I think that planning that's being forced by the state forces us to think about how we have housing for more than just one type of person, basically. And I think that's what it has right in it. Now, I don't think it works real well, as Brian can comment too, but there's chinks in it where it takes too long to do some simple things with your urban growth boundary, but that's process, not necessarily the outcome.
Yeah, I'd agree with what Kirk just said. The spirit of it, I think the spirit of Oregon land use planning, I think it's well intended. As we know, and if you're a practitioner, it comes down to a lot of legal compliance. It's very expensive and potentially litigious, which is why it takes so long. I think you could get similar outcomes with a much more simplified approach. But that aside, I think for folks to understand is a takeaway that, first of all, the fact that we're having this discussion, I think is fantastic. I think that's the spirit of the way this work typically takes place at the local level when we're dealing with issues of housing. Could be a development, could be development code, could be an urban growth boundary expansion, could be something related to growth and development. We have a really rich conversation with different opinions, which I think brings out the best in all of us. And we're going to just have to keep at it. That's one advantage of the state system, is it says you can't just kind of turn your back and walk away. You're going to have to keep going at this. It may take time, it may be laborious, it may be litigious, but you're you have to keep going at it and keep providing those ongoing supplies of land. And I think that gives us all a chance to kind of ask the next question that Ryan's talking about, which is, well, what's the next Bend going to look like in the next 20 or 30 years? And to bring in new information and to bring in demographic changes. And so I think it's imperfect. I think it works. And I just know that I think Bend is fantastic and the community is incredible. So it seems to be working really well. I do say the major deficit is it does not take care of the housing that is really not supported by the market. I think that's, for really affordable housing, folks making under $50,000, $60,000 a year, it's really hard to find a unit. So that's something that I think we need continue as a community need to continue to figure out how to work on that kind of housing. So leave it with that.
And I'll say too, there, to broaden the conversation, we've been focused on housing today, but that point right there, Brian's a good one to make when you start talking about what does it take to be livable. If you say, we want to have a livable town. And so then for it to be livable for folks across the spectrum, then you start bringing in transportation. There was a transportation question here that we don't have time to go into, but all these issues are related eventually. And so transportation, housing, education, the quality of life, all of these things. So my pitch to the audience and to Bend in general would be to continue to engage. Right now we are engaging with our community in new ways as people helping people, and we're helping our neighbors as we can during this crisis. And coming out of this, there's going to be great opportunities to engage as a community with a conversation about what's forward. So we're excited for that conversation to happen.
Well, great. There's nothing I can add to those comments. Those are beautifully said. Put a perfect bow on our discussion today. And I'll take that challenge. Maybe we can take some of those subjects into a future webinar here in the coming weeks. But I thank everybody. So many of you hung through all the way to the end. I know it's been a long day, but thank you all for joining us today. And feel free to send us comments, especially this will be on Facebook Live. Send us an email, whatever you'd like, on input on what you'd like to hear more about in the future. So once again, thank you. This town and community are worth fighting for, and thanks for being part of the conversation. Take care.
Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank
you.
Again.